Okay, so our next topic is mechanisms of hearing and balance. So we're going to look a little bit more at the structure of the ear and the structure of the eye. Again, like I said before, there's a lot of vocabulary. So throughout the PowerPoint, I just put in bold all of the things that I think you should know, all of the terminology that I think is important. So I would definitely make it a point to either write down the definitions that you don't know. This is even a good lecture for you to use flashcards on because, like I said, most of this is just basic definitions. You're really just, it's memory. Which structure of the brain would serve as the relay center for the smell sense? I am not 100% certain. It's actually funny because I've never seen a question about that on the MCAT. Um, I think it's probably something that a quick Google search would clear up, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. I'm assuming it goes directly to another part of the brain. But in the scope of the MCAT and the scope of this lecture, for now, all you need to know is that 4 out of the 5 go to the thalamus. Okay, so the ear is split into 3 sections. So the external ear, also known as the outer ear, which is right over here to the left, it contains the auricle, which is also known as the pinna, and it directs sound waves into the ear canal. So it's kind of like a satellite dish. It takes the vibrations in the air, the sound waves, and it sort of funnels them in to the ear canal. And the ear canal passes it onto the tympanic membrane. That should not be a C. The tympanic membrane is also known as the eardrum. You're going to find throughout this lecture that almost every single structure here has multiple names. So you should be familiar with both of them. So the auricle is the same as the pinna. Like we said, once it gets to the tympanic membrane, it vibrates, and it directly vibrates on the ossicles. So these little bones in here, excuse me, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, those are known as the ossicles. So they're really, really tiny bones that are in the inside of your middle ear. The malleus is also known as the hammer. The incus is also known as the anvil. And the stapes, I believe, is known as the stirrup. But I see these 3 more often, so I put those. So like I said, the tympanic membrane vibrates and it's directly touching the malleus. So you can see right over here on the actual diagram that they're physically touching each other. So these sound waves are now converted into just mechanical vibrations. So this tympanic membrane is actually going to vibrate up on the malleus. The malleus, incus, and stapes are all connected. So the vibration travels through those 3 bones, and then it crosses over to the oval window. So it's directly on the cochlea. The cochlea has a small, it's not listed here, but there's a small part of the cochlea which is called the oval window, and that's actually where the stapes hits the cochlea, and it causes vibration in the fluids inside the cochlea. So some other parts that are not directly involved in the processing of auditory information, but are important for the ear that are listed here are the round window, which relieves excess pressure inside the inner ear, and the eustachian tube, also which equalizes pressure by connecting the ear to the throat. So as I'm sure you know, your ear, nose, and throat are all connected. The eustachian tube is responsible for when your ears pop if you have a change in altitude. That's the eustachian tube equalizing the pressure inside and outside of your body. And you could see like your equilibrium is sometimes thrown off when you get a cold because that tube is sort of crowded. So it's a pretty important structure, and it's definitely noticeable when something's wrong with it. So a little bit more on the cochlea over here. The cochlea is where the mechanical vibrations are turned into electrical impulses. So if we go back over here, you can see this little snail-like structure labeled as the cochlea. It's filled with fluid, and throughout this fluid, there's a membrane that's running through it. It's called the basilar membrane. I have it on another slide as well, so don't worry. And that basilar membrane is covered in these little things called hair cells. So we're going to talk about the hair cells as well. The waves pass through the fluids in the cochlea, and they vibrate the hair cells on the basilar membrane, like I just said. When the cilia on top of the hair cells vibrate, the hair cells release neurotransmitters to the surrounding bipolar neurons, converting sound waves into electric impulses for the cochlear nerve. So if you look right up here, these little cells in pink are the hair cells, and the little projections that are coming on top of them, those are the cilia. So those are super, super fine hair-like structures that protrude into the fluid of the cochlea. So when the ossicles, those three little bones, start banging on the cochlea, it vibrates the fluid, and the fluid moves around, and it starts vibrating these hair cells. So when these hair cells start vibrating, they actually release neurotransmitters. So right at the bottom of these little pink, you see the beginnings of these yellow nerves, the yellow neurons, excuse me. So they're actually synapsing with these neurons. So neurotransmitters are released across that gap. And like I said before, these are bipolar neurons. So if you saw my lecture on the nervous system, I said that multipolar neurons are the most common in the nervous system, which is true. But now we're learning about bipolar neurons, and you'll see bipolar neurons a lot. They're always really involved in the reception of sensory information. So we'll see them again when we're talking about vision. But you can see right here, there are two axons. So the information will be passed onto the neuron right over here. It'll travel down this axon. And then this group of bodies is the spiral ganglion cells, because as we know, a ganglion is just a group of cell bodies, soma. And right over here is the auditory nerve. And as we know, auditory nerve is just a bundle of neurons, the bundle of the axons. So that's how, does anybody have any questions about how the mechanical is converted into electrical impulses? You can unmute, you can use the chat box if you like.
Can you start at the outer hair cells? I get everything. Sorry, this is Taja. I get everything from the synapses, like all the way to the ganglions, all that great stuff. But how do you get to the outer cells again? Are those the ones like around the membrane cochlea you said again?
Yeah, absolutely. So the outer hair cells is where it starts. So the outer hair cells, excuse me, are lined throughout the cochlea. That little this little circular structure that we're talking about, it swirls all the way in, and all throughout this there are hair cells, and they're actually ranging in size, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the vibration of the cochlea vibrates the fluid, and when the fluid moves, since these hair cells are suspended in the fluid, the hair cells are going to move too. So when the hair cells move, they respond to that mechanical input, and the bottom of the hair cells right over here release neurotransmitters in response to those hair cells, those cilia moving. So that's when they synapse, yep, and then the electrical impulse is created and it gets sent down the auditory nerve.
Yeah, I just didn't get like where the outer hair cells, I missed that connection, but okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. That cleared it up for you?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Okay, any other questions about that? Cool. So like I just said before, hair cells throughout the cochlea do differ in size, and therefore they register differ in the specific pitches they register. So I believe when you get to the very peak, right towards this inside, these hair cells are specific to lower frequencies. And as you start to move out towards this like outer curl, those are the ones that generate the higher frequencies. And those higher frequencies are the finer cells, the finer hair cells, and the finer cilia. So as you age, those are actually the first to go. It just kind of happens. The cells just, through wear and tear, they'll start to damage and they'll start to wither away. So that's why as you get older, you start to lose the ability to hear these higher pitches. And so the ear is not only used for hearing, it also helps us balance. So I put an image down there. It's the same ear, but we'll talk about it a little bit differently. So the semicircular canals are important. They contain three. One of them is the utricle, one of them is the saccule, and one of them is the ampullae. So they're tubes that are filled with fluid, and they are located next to the cochlea. So if you look right here, these three tubes that are they just look like three rings that are sort of right next to the cochlea. Those are the semicircular canals. So those are super important in terms of your bodily awareness. So they contain hair cells as well. And the way in which they switch mechanical vibrations to electrical impulses is basically the same way. but instead of detecting sound, they detect the rotational acceleration of your head and linear acceleration of your body as well. So before I talked a little bit about the vestibulocochlear nerve and how it sort of branches off into two divisions once it gets close to the ear. So you can actually see that pretty well in this image. This yellow nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve. And once it comes right over here, it actually splits off into two. So this part that's innervating the semicircular canals, we sometimes refer to as the vestibular nerve. And the one that's headed directly into the cochlear is called the cochlear nerve. Sometimes it's called the auditory nerve. Sometimes it's called the acoustic nerve. But these signals actually get transmitted to the brain through this same pathway once they converge. So we just call the entire thing the vestibulocochlear nerve. And the vestibular system communicates with the pons and cerebellum, and it helps maintain balance and equilibrium via that vestibulocochlear nerve. So we talked about the pons a little bit before. The pons and cerebellum are located towards the back of your brain. And just like the slide says, they are important for maintaining balance, equilibrium. They help you coordinate movements. And all of it is facilitated by the input of the vestibular system. Does anyone have any questions on that? Awesome. And if you think of any questions while I'm speaking, just pop them in the chat box. All right, so hearing loss. Whenever we get concepts that are generally conceptually easy, so like the pathways for vision and hearing, the MCAT likes to test like where defects happen in there. So I'll see hearing loss on it a lot. I'll see visual problems a lot, like nearsightedness and farsightedness. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So I thought it would be pretty helpful to include this on the pathways for vision and hearing. So there are two major types of hearing loss. The first one that I want to discuss is conductive hearing loss, and it occurs when the mechanical parts of the ear are obstructed or prevented from transmitting sound to the cochlea. So that's pretty much anything in your outer or the middle part of your ear. So those ossicles, if anything happens with them, if there's any sort of blockage in your ear canal, if there's any deformity in the auricle, anything that prevents those hearing waves from reaching the tympanic membrane and being converted into electrical impulses would be conductive hearing loss. So, I mean, there are a couple of causes for it. They can be congenital, they can be caused by illness, by head trauma. Opal said, we have 14 cranial nerves. Do we need to know which nerve is the vestibulocochlear? You don't really need to know anatomy for the MCAT at all. You really don't need to be able to identify. Anytime the 14 cranial nerves comes up on the MCAT, it'll probably be in a passage. But you should know, I think it's a good idea to know that the vestibulocochlear nerve does innervate these systems, just like you should know that the optic nerve innervates your eyes. So you don't really have to know like the specific pathway, how they travel. You don't have to identify them, you know, if they give you a map, like which is which, but you should definitely know that the structures that they innervate. No problem. Yep. Okay. So it affects the outer and middle ear, like I said, the auricle, ear canal, tympanic membrane, the ossicles, and it can be treated with surgery if there's corrective surgery that's available, or a conventional hearing aid. The conventional hearing aid will help amplify the sound and get it over to the tympanic membrane. And sensory neural hearing loss is the second type. So this occurs when the inner ear cannot successfully transmit electrical impulses down the cochlear nerve to the brain. So conductive hearing loss really focuses on not being able to transmit the mechanical information to the cochlea. And then sensory neural hearing loss, pretty much we're getting the information over to the cochlea, but there's a problem. There's a problem with the actual sensory neural. There's a problem with transferring the mechanical information into the electrical information and getting it to the brain. So this can be caused by aging, head trauma, disease, among a bunch of other different things. And obviously, since the nature of these two sorts of hearing losses are different, the treatments are a little bit different. So these treatments can be, they can include corticosteroids, Sometimes if it's head trauma or if there's a great deal of swelling, swelling can interfere with that vestibulocochlear nerve, and it can prevent information from getting to the brain. So sometimes they use corticosteroids to stop swelling. And there are cochlear implants as well. So I put the cochlear implant over here to the right. And it sits at the top of your ear. There's a transmitter that actually interacts with the cochlea. And this piece at the top, there's a microphone. The sound is input through the microphone. It goes through the processor, right up to the transmitter. And then that transmitter stimulates the cochlear nerve and the auditory nerve. So it doesn't allow the patient to hear completely perfectly, but it definitely allows for increased comprehension of speech. So, I mean, there are people that are not able to hear at all. They'll be able to, process certain sounds in their environment. And in combination with reading lips, language comprehension is greatly increased for those who are candidates for the cochlear implant.